Alright, so this is the lesson video for the second part of the chapter 11 notes and the first part of chapter 14. So we're going to cover the next 10 slides together, and hopefully you can get those notes packets filled in. Alright, so we ended in our last lesson with talking about how we have been detrimental to the ocean. So let's just cover some more of that stuff, and then we'll jump into how are we messing everything up by farming. Because you know that's what this class, we like to discuss how we do things wrong a lot. So coastal developments, what's wrong with us building all of these resorts and things like that near the beach? It gives us a place to go have fun, so how could it possibly damage anything? Well, it alters and destroys the coastal ecosystems. So we talked about previously the mangrove forests, the salt marshes, seagrass beds, coral reefs, all of those are disruptive when we change that environment. Coastal areas are overdeveloped, highly polluted, and overfished. So here's an example of an extremely crowded beach. All those people bring a lot of waste, a lot of pollution with them. Coastal management plans are inadequate. So yes, we want to manage this, but there's a lot of money to be made if you build a high-rise building right next to the beach. So that's the problem, is there's a lot of money made in vacationing, so people don't want to cut back on that. The biggest problem, of course, is human population size. That's pretty much across the board for this whole class. 60% of the world's population lives within 150 kilometers or 93 miles of a coastline. So again, highly populated areas bring a lot of pollution. So coral reefs, what are we doing to those? Because we're talking about a beach resort, so how are we messing up the coral reefs? Well, coral formations are important ecosystems and they're being degraded and destroyed. So how is this happening? Well, silt washing downstream from clear-cut forests is smothering the reefs. So again, even when we do something on land, eventually that pollution will go into a river or a stream and eventually it ends up in the ocean. And so that's what we said in the lesson video yesterday, is most of our ocean pollution actually comes from what we do on land as humans. So some coral reefs are going through a bleaching process, and that is when they're stressed, they expel their zooxanthellae. I'm going to assume that's how to say it. Remember, my background is chemistry. And so then they lose their color and they become white or whitish. And so that's correlated with warming ocean waters and increased dissolved CO2 levels. So the higher the temperature and the more CO2 in the ocean, the more acidic it is. And so they think that those two things are what's causing all this coral bleaching. High salinity from freshwater diversion projects. A lot of y'all keep asking me what salinity is. That's how much salt is in the ocean. Overfishing of top predators. Okay, anytime we mess with an ecosystem, whether we're fishing the bottom of the food chain, the top of the food chain, we're messing things up and it's causing havoc on the whole rest of the food chain. And then pollution from ocean dumping and coastal pollution. So again, all of these are destroying the coral reefs. So you may have seen shows about that because they have some of that on Netflix and stuff. So the ocean is warming along with global climate. All right, so in class we talked about the atmosphere warming. We talked about that in the last unit. But the ocean is also warming too. But it's difficult to accurately predict all future consequences. So remember, a lot of the graphs that I've been showing you in class, they have predictions on them of, okay, this is what's been happening, so if this continues, this is what will happen. So we've already talked about the rise in sea levels due to glaciers melting. So as temperature of the atmosphere increases, that ice melts, the ice has to go somewhere, it becomes water, and then it goes into the oceans, and so that's causing sea levels to rise. We also talked about how as water warms, it also expands. Coastal flooding is going to happen if those sea levels keep rising. We'll lose some of our wetlands that are close to the ocean. Flooding risks and saltwater intrusion is possible. Saltwater intrusion is just when saltwater goes where it's not supposed to be. So like in our estuaries and things where there may have been some fresh water in a certain area, it might now become saltwater. And again, plants that live there, animals that live there that aren't used to the salt content are going to have trouble surviving. So that was chapter 11, all about the ocean. So let's move on to chapter 14. So now we're going to talk about the land. All right, and we're going to mainly talk about what we're doing to the land through farming. All right, and where we get our food from. So there are two main problems in the world when it comes to food. The first one is undernutrition. This is a type of malnutrition in which there is underconsumption of calories or nutrients that leaves the body weakened and susceptible to disease. This is, of course, the one we hear about the most, people being hungry, not getting enough food. Even if you receive enough calories, undernutrition happens if not enough essential nutrients are received, like, for example, proteins, vitamins, and minerals. So even if somebody's getting enough to eat, to physically stay alive, if they're not getting certain essential parts in their food, then they can still be undernourished. The other problem that we deal more with in America is overnutrition. The amount of food consumed exceeds necessary calories or essential nutrients. So in other words, in some countries, they suffer with undernutrition. They have a lot of people not getting enough. In America, we mainly suffer from overnutrition. We're getting more than we need. This usually comes from diets high in saturated fat, sugar, and salt. It can result in high blood pressure, obesity, increased likelihood of diabetes, heart disease, etc. It's most common in the United States. Isn't that great? And other highly developed nations, and in urban areas of developing nations. So the problem that we're having over here is we're eating too much and a lot of the wrong foods, the foods that are high in saturated fats and things like that. So we have to watch that too. So, why are so many undernourished people in the world? Well, the main cause is poverty. So, what are some solutions? Well, we could increase sustainable production of food. Some countries, they have a lot of trouble producing enough food because they don't have necessarily good soil or things like that happening over there. We can improve food distribution. The thing is, there's technically like almost enough food in the world, but it's not spread out evenly. Like in America, we have way more food than we need. Whereas in like another country, they may be in desperate need of food. So we need to help distribute that food to make it fair to where everybody has access. Promote economic development. Remember, if we can get those developing countries a little bit better off, that will help. Ensure education and opportunities for women and small-scale farmers who produce significant amounts of basic nutrition in some regions. So if we can empower people in a poorer country, empower the women, empower the people who are trying to learn farming, teach them correct methods, give them the tools and resources they need, then they can start producing food for themselves and hopefully others. So, there are two main types of agriculture that we're going to talk about. Now, they each have subcategories, but there's two main types. One is industrialized agriculture. So it's utilized in highly developed and some developing countries. So we're a highly developed country, so we focus on industrialized agriculture in America. It's high input. It requires large capital. Capital means money. And energy inputs, less land and less manual labor than traditional methods. So some of the positive things are we can grow more food and take up less land because of the advancements we've made in the technologies in agriculture. And it doesn't require as much manual labor because we have a lot more machines and technology to do this for us. The problem is, though, it takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of energy, which of course usually comes from fossil fuels, and so there's a lot of pollution. So it's significantly dependent on fossil fuels, so this would be a negative. It does produce high yields, though. So, for example, industrialized agriculture, in the same amount of land, you can produce more food, so that's a positive. Monoculture cultivation predominates. Mono just means one, so that's where when you're driving down the interstate or something, you see a huge farm and you realize, oh my gosh, this is acres and acres and acres of just corn. That's a monoculture. It's growing one crop at a time. That's actually a negative. We'll talk about that a little later. Soil degradation, because if you grow the same crop over and over and over again, it's going to use up the same nutrients that doesn't get a chance to be replenished. Pesticide resistance is also common. They use a lot of pesticides, and eventually some of the pests that can make it, remember that genetic diversity we've talked about, they'll become resistant to that pesticide, and then it's not going to work on them anymore. So the other main type is subsistence farming. So this is utilized by most farmers in developing countries. So this is more like the old style of farming that you would think about. Traditional agricultural methods that depend on labor and a large amount of land. So this is where you think of like a farmer who gets up at the crack of dawn and goes and works his own land. Usually they only make about enough food to feed themselves. So like a large family, they could feed themselves. They don't really make enough food to feed other people. So really we kind of need a balance between industrialized and subsistence farming. Cultivation methods vary depending on the area, and so these are some of the different methods that subsistence farmers use. So they use shifting cultivation. That's where they plant something, they kind of let the land rest, they'll plant something later, let the land rest. The whole point of letting the land rest is to let the nutrients build back up in the soil so you don't degrade the land. They do slash and burn agriculture. That's where you go cut down a forest, burn everything, plant a bunch of stuff, because once you burn a forest, the soil is really fertile and it's really good for the plants, but as you plant more crops, they use up the nutrients and the soil is degraded again. Nomadic herding, that's just where they go around and with a herd of animals and they just take them wherever they can find food and water for those animals. Intercropping and polyculture, those are both related. They both deal with planting multiple varieties of plants. So like I was talking about a second ago, that huge farm with all those acres of corn, you might have corn here, you might have peanuts here, you might have peach trees over here, so you'll have a varying type of crop that you're planting in a certain area. Alright, so what are some challenges of producing more crops and livestock? Like, what's the problem? Why have we not conquered this? Well, challenges include decline in farmland. The more you use farmland, the easier it is to degrade the soil. If you don't have the means to re-fertilize the soil through things like fertilizers, then you're just stuck having to move on. Declining numbers of domesticated varieties. Again, we like to cultivate and use crops that we know are the best. And so all that genetic diversity is decreasing. Continuing to improve crop and livestock yields. So again, more people, even if we increase how much corn we make one year, we're going to have more people the next year. So then we got to increase it even more. And then addressing environmental impacts. All of this is detrimental. Between the pesticides we use, the fertilizers we use, that's a lot of pollution. Even things like raising cattle, they release a lot of methane, which is one of our greenhouse gases we talked about. Agribusiness conglomerates, which are just the huge people who are getting really rich off agriculture, are replacing the family farm. So small farmers are having trouble making ends meet because these huge businesses are taking over. And then it's a victim of urbanization and suburban sprawl. So you may be a farmer, and if a city expands and takes over your farmland, then you're stuck with having to move on somewhere else. And so farmland's turning into parking lots, housing developments, and shopping malls. All right, so we'll stop here for this lesson video, and I will finish up this packet with the next video.